Hi there, Michael.
Hi there, Laura. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Thanks for asking. And welcome everybody to our webinar on the testing and regulatory requirements for the EU Radio Equipment Directive and also the UK radio regulations. My name is Laura Llewellyn and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to our technical expert, Michael Darby. Michael is the technical director for our Global Connected Technologies division within Element. He's worked as a manufacturer, test engineer and certification body. Michael is a notified body for the EU and an approved body for the UK. He is an active member of the EU notified body groups, responsible for many technical papers on the topic of radio approvals and integration of radio into other equipment. He is also an active ETSI member and a contributor to ETSI standards and technical secretary for the EMC Test Lab Association. He provides education and training activities, including webinars and seminar workshops. Before I hand you over to Michael, I just wanted to encourage everyone to submit any questions you have on the GoToWebinar panel to the right-hand side of your screen. And if you do lose connection for any reason, please refresh your browser or re-enter the GoToWebinar platform. Thank you, everyone. And with that, I'll now hand you over to Michael.
Cool. Thank you very much, Laura. I will now share my screen. Okay. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to my webinar on the European Union's Radio Equipment Directive and the UK's radio equipment regulations. So, as Laura said, my name is Michael Darby, and I'm Technical Director here at Element Materials. At Element, we've got labs and locations all around the world, and I'm very happy to be part of our Connected Technology group, dealing with all things wireless. Here at Element, we provide support and consultancy and product development from the early stages of your product. We do testing, of course, for EMC, RF exposure and SAR, radio and wireless testing, product safety, and GMA, and that includes product certifications such as regulatory approvals. For me personally, I started my career over 30 years ago working for an equipment manufacturer, doing EMC testing and getting products through EMC compliance. I then spent most of my career in the test and certification industry, testing for EMC and radio, both in the UK and in the USA, and as a TCB for the USA and a notified body for the EU, and most recently an approved body for the UK. I spend a lot of my time also teaching, training, giving webinars and face-to-face seminars, and helping people solve their product problems. Okay, so the topics for today really is regulatory approvals for the EU, and we'll talk a little bit about the UK or Great Britain at the end. We're going to go over some of the testing requirements and the authorization requirements. Now, the authorization requirements are important because it's pretty unusual that anyone wakes up in the morning and says to themselves, I'd like to go and buy an EMC test. I'm really interested to watch ESD. It sounds very exciting, and that's what I want to do with my day. In reality, what you really want to do is get your product to market as quickly as possible. And it's the same with radio testing. It's pretty unusual that anybody has a burning desire to know exactly how long Bluetooth lasts on each channel before hopping to the next one. What you really want to do is just get that test out of the way and get your product to market as quickly as possible. And why is getting to market as quickly as possible so important? Well, I've put together this very simple slide here. It's not going to win me any awards in economics, but hopefully I'll get the point across. When you first start developing a product, you start spending money. You spend money on the development and testing of a product, and then at some point you get your regulatory compliance all out of the way and your product is fully developed and you're able to launch your product. And then the money starts coming in, and at some point you cross over the original point and you start making a profit. Now that product at some point is going to go end of life. You may not actually have a say in when that end of life happens. Maybe you have, maybe you bring out a subsequent model, or maybe one of your competitors brings out a better model. Or maybe you're making your product for an event, such as Christmas or the Olympics or the European Football Championships. And then that event happens and your product isn't needed anymore. So if your access to market is delayed, you're going to be spending more money in that period, and then getting your product into the profitable zone is going to happen later, but your end of life of that product may still happen at the same time. The recommendation, therefore, and the approach from most manufacturers is to get your product to market as quickly as possible. Even if it means a steeper rate of spend in the early days, getting your product to market is the ultimate goal. I've known people waste 3 or 4 weeks trying to avoid a test which takes half a day. Or maybe they'll try and cut corners in the testing stage and then find that their regulatory approvals takes 2 or 3 or 6 months longer than it should do, purely because they saved a few $100s during the testing. This isn't a good long-term strategy. Okay, so on the topic of testing and approvals then, people often think of testing and approvals as being the same thing, but they're really not. There's testing and there is approvals. You can have your product tested and it's not approved. And if the testing is incorrect or to the incorrect standard, or you've taken the wrong approach, then your product may be fully tested, but will never be accurately approved, and therefore you can't sell it or shouldn't sell it. Similarly, you could have a device or components within a device which appear to be approved, but when you combine them together or you operate it in a more real-world environment, you might find that this device, which appears to be correctly approved, wouldn't actually pass any tests. For example, a multiple radio device could be tested by market surveillance in a way which fails tests, but it may have seemed to have been approved by your own processes. So we want to talk about that a little bit today. The main purpose of the seminar really is to help you understand the basic requirements. I mean, this is a basic overview webinar, so we're going to go over the fundamentals. Most of my webinars and seminars are based on the most common mistakes that I see people make on a day-to-day basis. And this is an observation period of more than 30 years. So it's pretty well founded on the mistakes that people make, I think. As I said, this is all about getting you and your products to market as quickly as possible, but also increasing product quality, because in general, if the products are correctly tested and correctly authorized, it goes hand in hand that the quality of the product increases. That's especially the case with multi-radio equipment and the EMC immunity tests as well. And of course, reducing your risks once your product is on the market. So that's the risk of being taken off the market or being found to be non-compliant. Quick look at the agenda for today then. We want to understand the compliance requirements, look at the difference between testing and authorization, have a quick talk about what those testing requirements are, and how to get your radio equipment authorized for Europe. And then how do you maintain compliance if the standards change, or if you make a change to your product, or if you notice the way people are using your product changes. Timing, well, this would normally be at least a one-day seminar for me, this topic, and sometimes even 2 days. But today we've got about an hour, and I'll try and keep to the hour. We've allocated a little more than an hour, and I'll make sure that I leave plenty of time to go over everybody's questions. Okay, so let's start with the main region of interest then, the European Union. And if you want to sell radio equipment into the European Union, you're going to be using the Radio Equipment Directive, which is often known as the RED. That's not the RED directive, because the D of RED means directive. There's the number of the directive, and means it was published in 2014, and we've been using it since 2016. So this is a 5-year-old procedure that we're going through here, and it replaced the old R&TTE directive back in 2016. When would the RED apply to your equipment then? Well, basically any type of radio equipment entering into the market in the EU. There are some exceptions. So if you look in the RER, there are exempted types of device, such as devices that are only used for military or national security and wouldn't be used in domestic environments, or other types of equipment such as aircraft or maritime radios, which are covered exclusively by those directives. But in general, anything that's got a radio function in it for kind of commercial or industrial or domestic use. And when I say any type of radio function, I'm meaning transmitters, receivers, or transceivers. And that's any frequency range of up to 3000 gigahertz. So I'll often hear from people who say, well, I have a product and it isn't radio equipment, so I think the EMC directive and the low voltage directive apply to my product. And then I'll look at the documentation and say, well, it says here the product knows where it is. How does it do that? And I'll say, well, it's got a GPS receiver in it, but it's not a transmitter, and we didn't make the receiver. Well, sorry, but that is a radio equipment. It has GPS or a radio receiver in it, and that product would be in scope of the RER, not the EMC and low voltage directives. So if your product is a radio, you've perhaps manufactured it to be a radio, or maybe you've manufactured a product and put somebody else's radio inside it. In either case, you've got radio equipment and it's within scope of the RER. So the RER is a trade directive. It's not a technical document. Now, hopefully you've realized that this webinar is part 3 of a 4-part webinar. And in the first part, we went over the FCC and ISED Canada requirements, and we talked about how the FCC rules and the Canadian standards contain all the output power limits and the spurious emissions limits, things like that. Well, if you look through the RER, you won't find terms such as megahertz or dBm, how many watts of transmitter should operate at. It's a trade directive for putting products on the market in the EU. Now, it does have a section within the RER, it's Article 3, and it lists some essential technical requirements. It doesn't specify what the technical requirements are, but it states that a product must demonstrate compliance with safety, EMC, and use of the RF spectrum or radio performance, and some other requirements also. So the directive calls out essential requirements. The only authorization route available for radio equipment to the RER is declaration of conformity by the manufacturer. There's no certification to the RER. There's no CE certification of radio equipment. So let's have a look at this declaration of conformity then. There's one declaration of conformity and it applies to the final product. And all aspects of the device are covered by that one DOC. Even if the aspects have been tested separately, one DOC applies and there's no certification. So when we went over products for the FCC, we talked about how one product might have multiple certifications existing and it might have multiple DOC procedures existing. However, with the RER and the EU, the DOC is a document rather than just a procedure, and one declaration of conformity applies to the whole product. The DOC is by the manufacturer, and only the manufacturer can complete the declaration of conformity. When we say manufacturer, what we usually mean is the actual original equipment manufacturer. What we're really talking about is the company whose name is on the product. So if you design and develop and build a product and your name is on the product, then you are the manufacturer. Even if you've had the components soldered together in a factory in the Far East, that doesn't make them the manufacturer. You are the manufacturer because you're responsible for the product and your name is on it. If somebody else rebrands your product, they become the legal manufacturer and they would become responsible for completing a DOC. Similarly, if you take somebody else's product and you rebrand it to put your name on it and you placing it on the market, then you are the manufacturer and you have to create the DOC. And the DOC is stating that you declare its compliance with the RER. There are also some legal responsibilities for other companies. Any company involved in putting a product on the market is known as an economic operator. And the red describes responsibilities for the manufacturer, an importer, and a distributor. A manufacturer can be anywhere in the world. So if the manufacturer is in the EU, then when they place their products on the market in the EU, there won't be an importer because the manufacturer is already there. However, if the manufacturer is outside of the EU, such as in the Far East, China, the Americas, USA, or even in the UK, then the manufacturer is outside the EU and a company within the EU is importing the equipment. So in the scope of the red, the importer takes on some legal responsibility. They have to prove or demonstrate to themselves at least that they have imported a compliant product, and they have to add their name and address details to the product or packaging before they import it. There are also legal responsibilities for any company distributing equipment around the EU. There's the option to use an authorized representative in the red, but it's not a mandatory process or not a mandatory role for the Radio Equipment Directive. However, in July this year, this month basically, there are some changes to the market surveillance requirements in the EU. So that's not a change to the red itself, it's a change to a higher level market surveillance. And this does mean that there can be cases for an authorized representative for radio equipment. The basic point here is, of course, we know that there are many websites where an end user or a domestic home can go online and buy equipment and buy that product directly from a company outside the EU, and that product could get shipped from outside the EU straight to the person's home. Now, legally speaking, of course, that person then is the importer, but that's a difficult thing to track. And also some of these online store companies, they have these things, distribution centers or fulfillment centers, warehouses basically, where the equipment gets placed in this fulfillment center or building in the EU before it's available for sale. So officially not on the market at that point. Then when somebody buys it, it's sent from that center to their home, and there isn't really an importer. So there's a loophole established there. And that loophole's being closed up this month, such that basically if the manufacturer is outside the EU, and if there is no importer of that product, then there must be an authorized representative. Okay, so what is this assessment for the scope for the Radio Equipment Directive then? What are the technical essential requirements? Well, there's product safety, covered in Article 3.1a of the RED. EMC performance, that's EMC emissions and EMC immunity in Article 3.1b. Radio performance, that's transmitter performance and receiver performance under Article 3.2. And some other categories. Now, I've given webinars and seminars on the Radio Equipment Directive many times, and over the years, this would probably be the last time I mentioned those other categories of Article 3.3. I'd say there are some other things, but let's not worry about them too much now. Well, really, the time is coming to start worrying about those a little bit, because some of those categories are going to become enabled soon. If you want to try and picture Article 3.3 of the RED, I always find myself picturing a bank of switches that could be turned off or on by the European Commission. Presently, most of them are turned off. There's one that's on, and it's for connection to emergency services for things like safety of life at sea equipment or avalanche beacons. Well, that Article 3.3 part is being expanded next year to include mobile phones, such that phones must be able to make an emergency voice call. Similarly, very soon we're expecting some other aspects of Article 3.3 to be switched on. Things like cybersecurity, prevention from fraud and protection of data. These things haven't happened yet, so let's not go into the detail on this webinar, but keep your eyes open and we'll make sure we have a webinar when that takes place. Okay, so Let's look then at the assessment to the radio equipment directive. If you've got your radio equipment, you're going to have to assess it for safety. And that means product safeties. For example, if it's an appliance or a multimedia device or anything, product safety needs to be performed, but also safety of the radio. So if it's a transmitter, there'll be RF exposure and maybe a SAR assessment. There's EMC emissions and immunity, and that covers the radio performance, so the EMC performance whilst the radio is in operation, but also anything else. So, for example, people often talk about a wireless enabled washing machine when they want to talk about mixtures of product. Well, you'd have the safety test and the EMC test of the washing machine, but you'd also have the safety test and the EMC test of the radio performance link. And then radio as a separate part, so the radio transmitter and receiver performance, and those other Article 3.3 categories. So as a manufacturer, you need to do an assessment of all of those parts, probably testing, and then they are all going to filter down to the red. You'll notice that I haven't listed the EMC directive and the low voltage directive, and that's because safety and EMC are included in the red, and therefore the EMC directive and the low voltage directive do not apply to radio equipment. Maybe the radio equipment does come under the scope of other directives though. If it has medical operation, it comes into the medical directive or the machinery directive, then there may also be an assessment to that directive, and that would lead down to compliance of that directive. And then finally, the manufacturer would create one DOC for the whole product to all the applicable CE marking directives. And maybe you'd also see the ROS directive on this slide as well. So I've mentioned about placing a product on the market, and this is one of the most confusing things for a lot of people who are quite new to this industry. Most of us have been doing it for a long time, and we've come to understand this situation now, but I really want to make it clear that when you're placing a product on the market, you're assessing a product, and each time an individual unit reaches the market with its declaration of conformity, the DOC document applies to the unit that it goes with. So if the following day you're selling a new unit, then that day, that declaration of conformity applies. I'll try and show you what I mean now. Let's say, for example, you've designed and developed a product, you've tested it, it's compliant with the latest standards based on how you know it will be used and how you know where it will be used. And let's say your marketing team predicts that you can sell 3,000 of these things. So you think, right, okay, they're going to start off in my factory, and then they're going to go onto the shelves in a shop in the EU. And then from there, they're going to end up in the user's home or the user's office and be used. And as I said, you're expecting to sell 3,000 of these units over the next few years. So the first 1,000 of them, they come out of the factory, they go to the shop, and then they go to the user. So they are on the market in the EU. The next 1,000 units come out of the factory and they go to the shop in the EU. So they're in the EU and they're available for sale. They are on the market. But 1,000 of them are still in the factory. They haven't come off the production line yet. Maybe the factory is in Europe and maybe it isn't, but they're not actually on the market yet. They're last 1,000 units. Then the standard changes. And so the testing requirements change, whether it's EMC, safety, or radio performance. The 1,000 units that are with the user do not need to be recalled. They're already on the market. And the 1,000 units which are in the shops do not need to be recalled because they are already on the market in the EU. But the 1,000 units that have not left the factory yet are not yet on the market. Even though they've got the exact same model number and construction type as the other units that are already out there, those individual units that have not yet left the factory and not yet been placed on the market must be reassessed because their DOC will go with them on the day they are placed on the market. Okay, so what does a manufacturer do then when he wants to assess his product to the Radio Equipment Directive. Now, in the olden days, it used to be a case that you would just say, right, I've got my product, I'm going to look online, find a handful of standards, test to the standards, then I'm done, I put my CE mark on and start selling it. Well, things have moved on a little bit since there, and actually the first thing the manufacturer must do is start to create their risk assessment. The manufacturer's risk assessment is kind of a large document that encompasses all of the compliance aspects and decisions that the manufacturer must make through their journey to get their product to market. I often tell people that it's the first document you must open when you first start planning your product, and then the last document you close when you've completed all the testing. Maybe you've had a notified body certificate and you're ready to put your product on the market. So we'll go through some of the key things that you as a manufacturer would need to think about as part of your assessment planning and your risk assessment. Well, first things first, can I even sell it into the EU? You might have had an idea of a product and it's a great idea based on what you think you can build. Or maybe you've got a product which sells perfectly well in the USA or Canada. Do not assume that it can always be sold in the EU. The frequency bands may not be the same, or the laws about which types of product are permitted may not be the same. If it cannot be sold anywhere in the EU, then you cannot CE mark it and you cannot place it in the market in the EU. Where in the EU can I sell it? Well, remember that the EU is made up of 27 individual countries. So there could be a situation where your product can be used in some EU countries, but not in all of them. If it can be used in all of the countries, then that's fine, and you can move your product freely around the EU. But if there's only some countries that it can be used in, then you need to be able to restrict that. There are two classes of product within the RED. There's Class 1 or there's Class 2. The definition of a Class 1 device is one that can be placed on the market and put into service without restriction anywhere in the EU. So that would require that the frequency band it uses is harmonized across all the countries and there's no restriction of placing it into service. So let's look, for example, at Bluetooth or 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi. The frequency band is harmonized all around the EU, and there's no restriction to turning it on or putting it into service. So that would be a Class 1 device. Let's say you have a receiver device that operates on some frequency and is compliant. Well, it wouldn't interfere with anybody's spectrum. It can be used in any member state, we assume, and it can be switched on and used in any member state. So a receiver-only equipment would be Class 1. Now let's look at something like 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi. 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi uses a harmonized frequency band, so that's okay, but it can only be used indoors. So there is a restriction. So that would be a Class 2 device, where the definition of a Class 2 device is it's not Class 1. Now let's look at something like the 900 megahertz RFID systems in the 915 to 921 megahertz band. Those devices could be used anywhere. However, not every EU member state allows those. So those would be a Class 2 device because the frequency band is not harmonized. When there's a Class 2 device, your product packaging and user manual needs to show a little picture of which countries where the restriction exists, and the user manual needs to carefully explain what the restrictions are. Can I sell it the way I want to? Well, what I really mean by that is everybody wants one global solution for their products so that they could just sell it worldwide and let's let the user figure out which country they're in. That's all very well, but unfortunately allowing the user to set country regions or frequency bands is not okay for most devices. And therefore, probably if you're going to place a product onto a market, you need to be able to restrict it in such a way that it will only be used in that location, or it's compliant when used in that location. So you might have a situation where you have a USA device with its FCC ID on it, and you have a European version with its CE mark on it, and you may or may not be able to have a global solution with the FCC ID and the CE mark, depending on what type of product it is. Do I need to test it? Now, you may remember when we did the FCC and ICED webinar a few weeks ago that the response to this was, yes, you definitely need to test it and you must follow perfectly the correct standard. Well, we're on the EU RED now, so do I need to test it? No, you really don't need to test it, but most likely you will test it. The RED does not mandate testing, but most people do test for safety, EMC, radio, and those other requirements. The reality is there's nothing that says you have to test it, but you do have to assess it for compliance to Article 3's essential requirements. So you as a manufacturer need to demonstrate and have evidence that your product meets the safety, EMC, radio performance, and any other requirements. And standards exist to demonstrate that. And the standards are test standards. So that's why most people do test. And it's definitely the recommended solution. But it would be wrong of me to sit here and tell you you have to test when there's nothing that legally mandates you do. There's a choice of test lab. You don't need to use an accredited test lab, and there is no list of approved test labs for the Radio Equipment Directive. However, you can assign your declaration of conformity based on the evidence of those test results. So you really want to make sure you pick a lab who knows what they're doing. What standards should I test to? The standards are written by two groups, ETSI and Senelec. ETSI deal with the radio performance and EMC on radio devices, and Senelec deals with the safety assessments and the EMC of the non-radio parts. There's such a thing as a harmonized standard on the official journal. So when ETSI, for example, publish a standard, or Senelec, they hope in most cases that it will become a harmonized standard. And the European Commission has a document called the Official Journal of Harmonized Standards. When the European Commission places a standard on their Official Journal of Harmonized Standards, then that standard gives you what's known as a presumption of conformity. And what that means is, if you fully test to that harmonized standard that's listed on the official journal, then you have presumption of conformity for that aspect of your device. And it would require somebody else to prove that you haven't got conformity. So if we use the example of Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, where there is a harmonized standard listed on the official journal, if you test and fully comply with that standard, then you can say you have presumption of conformity for the Bluetooth or Wi-Fi operation of your product. So for that part of your assessment, you've got presumption of conformity, and it would be somebody else's responsibility to prove otherwise. If you don't use a harmonized standard, perhaps because there isn't one or you can't apply it, you can still use non-harmonized standards. So for example, that same Bluetooth device, presently the safety standards and the EMC standards are not harmonized. So you'd have to use non-harmonized standards, and then it's the manufacturer's responsibility to explain and justify why their product is compliant when they didn't use harmonized standards. You can actually use draft standards or even just a draft test plan if no standards exist. It's not a case that you only test to the standards available. You pick all of the compliance risks of your product and you assess them to the way you can, ideally with a harmonized standard, or if there isn't one, you pick a standard, perhaps from another directive. If there isn't a standard that's appropriate, then maybe you need to find a draft one. And if there isn't even a draft standard, then you'd need to create a test plan or some sort of way of evaluating your product. And a notified body may be needed. So in cases where the harmonized standard is not listed on the official journal, you may need a notified body to issue a certificate. And I'll come on to that on a later slide. So which standards should I test to? All applicable standards. Now I mentioned before, for example, about the washing machine with Bluetooth. If a product has multiple modes of operation, you're going to have to test and assess them all. You don't just pick one. People used to talk about this term primary function, where you'd say, well, what is it then? Is it a washing machine, or is it a Wi-Fi? Or is it a multimedia device, or is it a wireless device? Well, people don't really use the term primary function anymore because all of those things apply. So if multiple standards could apply to a product, then you have to apply all of those standards. And so you are assessing your whole product, the whole radio equipment to the directive, even if there are no standards yet published for it. Is there anything not covered by the standards? Well, everything must be assessed. So if you're aware that your product has something that the standard hasn't covered, then you must assess that. You've got to remember that product development typically moves faster than the standards. The standards try and keep up with the technology advances. So your DOC is to the directive. The standard is kind of a starting point. Your risk assessment will document and any sort of evaluations and judgments about anything your product does which hasn't been included in the standard. It's the manufacturer's decision to sign their DOC based on their assessment. Will I need a notified body certificate? Well, why am I talking about a certificate when I've clearly said that it's a DOC process? If you fully apply harmonized standards for the radio part, Article 3.2, and in the future those Article 3.3 when they become enacted, then you do not need a notified body because you have a presumption of conformity for the Article 3.2. However, if you do not have the CE presumption of conformity for the, excuse me, go back a slide. If you do not have presumption of conformity for Article 3.2, or you are unable to fully apply harmonized standards for the radio part, then you need a notified body's type examination certificate before you can sign your DOC. You must label the product with the CE mark, and the CE mark goes on the product and on the packaging, and also the manufacturer's name and address so that anybody could contact the manufacturer if they have any questions. And you need to control compliance going forward. You need to make sure that you're always placing compliant products on the market. So if you've tested one product one day and then you carry on selling identical products for years and the standards don't change, how are you making sure that all of those other ones are still compliant? Well, the red states that you must do sample testing. It doesn't state how much sample testing you must do or how often you must do it, because of course the red doesn't know if you're selling one product a year or hundreds of products per week. So it's each manufacturer's decision on how much sample testing they perform based on their control of their quality system, their manufacturing, and how many products they make. As a manufacturer, you must track the changes through the life of placing your products on the market. If you remember my example before about the 3,000 units and how you start placing them on the market and then the requirements change, you're going to have to reassess your device. So the standards could change, and they often do. Changes in the standards can be a headache for many manufacturers, but I will say that most changes in standards are triggered by manufacturers so that they can update the standards to allow their new types of products. If your equipment changes, so if you're the compliance manager in your company, you need to really keep a close eye on your engineering development team and your manufacturing to make sure that you know if they're changing components or making any changes at all to your equipment, and that includes the hardware or the firmware. And also watching the way your products are used, because your assessment of your product is based on your hardware, of course, and your software and the standards, but also assessed for a way that you are looking at how your product is intended to be used and any reasonably foreseen use. And if you notice that people are using your product in a way you did not anticipate, then you may have to reassess your product. Remember that you have a DOC for each new unit on each new day or week or however often you sell a product. You must maintain your technical documentation and keep it up to date. So here's a picture of your technical documentation. Hopefully it's a little tidier than that. It describes the compliance of your device. If somebody was to look at the technical documentation of your product, it should clearly describe why your product is compliant to the RER. You must keep it for 10 years after the product is placed on the market. It's really for your manufacturing records, but also a market surveillance authority. If they were to take a product from the market, and if they have a question for you, they will contact you, the manufacturer, and ask for your technical documentation, and they must receive it. And similarly, if you go to a notified body and ask for a type examination certificate, then you must provide the technical documentation to the notified body. So what is contained in the technical documentation? Well, firstly, you have to identify the radio equipment. So the user manual will be in there, or maybe some installation instructions. And by the way, the rated output power of your transmitter and the frequency band that you transmit over must be in your user manual. That's not just simply copying what is the power limit in the standard you've used, it's the rated power of your radio. It doesn't have to be the precise value you measured in the test lab, but it's the rated power of your product and the frequency range you use. Your technical documentation must include photos, external and internal, to be able to identify the product that you assessed, and of course, list the hardware and software versions, if appropriate. There should be a technical operation description, circuit diagrams, parts lists, ratings and tolerance, block diagrams, all of the normal technical stuff to describe a radio. Test reports will be in your technical documentation, and that will be for all of the safety aspects, so product safety, acoustic safety, RF exposure safety, EMC, emissions and immunity for all aspects of the device, and the radio, transmitter and receiver performance. If there are any other requirements, such as the Article 3.3 when they become enacted, or anything else that you identify about your product which you know needs an assessment to cover safety or interference with other equipment. Your documents which justify your compliance with the RER. So you have to document the list of harmonized standards you applied, if indeed you applied any, and you also need to list any non-harmonized standards you applied, if you applied any. And if you did apply any non-harmonized standards, you must provide your explanation or justification in your risk assessment of why you think that non-harmonized standard was the right thing to use for the RER. And I've got to tell you that market surveillance are looking very closely at that at the moment. And of course, your risk assessment must be in your technical documentation. So if anyone asks for your technical documentation file, they will expect to see your risk assessment with all of the things I've mentioned in there today. Article 10.2. So Article 10.2 of the RER is basically the clause which states that you have to be able to use this product in at least one EU member state if you want to CE mark it. And this is one of the things that I mentioned, which is the top item I mentioned when we talked about planning your compliance. So you need to have your evidence that it can be used in the EU in your technical documentation file. And Article 10.10, this was the part about what if it can only be used in one or some of the EU member states. If it cannot be used in all EU member states, then you need to describe which countries it can be used in and what the restrictions are. And that evidence would also be in your technical documentation. If you have a notified body certificate, that would be in the documentation, as would a copy of your declaration of conformity. If you have a device which contains multiple radios, then all of this just becomes a little bit more complicated, and this is more for you to think about. A lot of the radio standards or test standards are written by a group of people who are very, very focused on what they need to do. So the Bluetooth test standard will be written by people thinking about Bluetooth. The LTE test standard will be written by people thinking about LTE. And the GPS receiver standard will be written by people focusing on that technology. If you have put all of those radios into one product, there isn't really one standard, and there certainly isn't a harmonized standard on how to deal with that. There are guidance documents, there's a RER TGN, and there's a ETSI guidance documents on what to do, but it's the manufacturer's responsibility to ensure that the combination of radios is going to remain compliant. When we talked about the FCC a few weeks ago, I pointed out an FCC clause that says if you've got multiple transmitters in your device, they must all be enabled during testing, if indeed that's a normal mode. But with the RER, that clause doesn't exist in the RER, of course, because it doesn't go into such technical detail. So it's the manufacturer's responsibility to ensure that the combination of radios of their device is compliant. Similarly, if you have multiple directives or multiple types of operation applying to your device, then that's something you need to think about and you need to demonstrate. So obviously the most simple would be something like multimedia with radio in, or the washing machine with radio in, or maybe you have a medical device where multiple directives then applying and standards. You may have an EMC standard for the medical environment, and then you may have an EMC standard for radio equipment. And so you're now looking at radio equipment in the medical environment. So you're going to be assessing your radio performance, but the EMC immunity levels of the medical environment standard, for example, would take priority. So you'd have to test your radio to a different set of limits. And a test plan and a good discussion with a test lab becomes very important when you start mixing operations, mixing directives. This is actually a lot more complicated than people think. People are making more and more complex products, and they kind of think that the regulations should have remained just as simple as they were when a product just did one thing. So at the end of this, then you've developed your product. You've decided it can be placed on the market in the EU. You've figured out which countries will accept it. You've done all your testing, maybe at a test lab, maybe at your own lab. You've maybe got your notified body certificate if you need it. You've signed your declaration of conformity. You've completed your technical documentation. So that's time then to close your risk assessment. So what is a notified body and what do we actually do for a living? I am a notified body for the RER and the EMC directive. So the declaration of conformity is always by the manufacturer. So what is this notified body type examination certificate? Well, the clue is in the word examination. It's not a type approval certificate. Notified body, we're industry groups, often associated with a test lab, and they're designated by the EU. And our role is to review the radio equipment, or more specifically, to review the technical documentation of the radio equipment and decide if we think that equipment meets the essential requirements of the Radio Equipment Directive. If you fully applied harmonized standards for radio performance, you do not need the notified body certificate. If you have not fully applied harmonized standards for all of the radio aspects, then you do need a notified body certificate. But in all cases, the notified body certificate is available to you if you would like it. So is the notified body certificate mandatory? Well, as I said, for Article 3.2, the radio part, or Article 3.3, those other acts when they become enabled, it will be mandatory if you haven't used the harmonized standards. But for Articles 3.1a and 3.1b, that's the safety and EMC, you can use non-harmonized standards without it triggering mandatory use of a notified body. So let's say, for example, you don't use harmonized standard for Article 3.2 for the radio part. So you need a notified body certificate. You go along to the notified body and you can say, please just review Article 3.2 because I didn't fully apply harmonized standards there. And the notified body can say, okay, I'll just review Article 3.2. Or you could say, please review 3.1 and 3.2, and the notified body could review them all. One thing the notified body cannot do is review only a part of Article 3.2. So let's say you've got 3 or 4 transmitters in your product, or 3 or 4 radios, excuse me, and most of them have fully applied harmonized standards, but just one of your radios doesn't have a harmonized standard yet. And so you weren't able to apply a harmonized standard for one of the radios in your product. So you have to go to the notified body. You can't say to the notified body, please just review that one. They can't do that. If they're going to review your product, they have to review all of your product. So how does it compare in quality, I guess, to the testing of the standards? Well, if a harmonized standard is available to you, you are strongly encouraged to test to it. The role of the notified body is intended to be used when there isn't a harmonized standard available, or if indeed you can't meet the harmonized standard. The assessment by the notified body is intended to be at least equivalent to the standards. So if there isn't a harmonized standard, you would work with a notified body to provide an assessment that is equivalent to if a standard did exist. Important point there then is if you said, well, there is a harmonized standard, but I can't test all of it, or I didn't do one of the tests, or I failed one of the tests, you can't just say, well, I'll go and get a notified body certificate instead then. Of course, you can do that, but you're going to have to demonstrate to the notified body how your compliance with the directive is at least as good as the standard would have been. And interestingly, if a harmonized standard does exist, but you choose not to apply it, and you go to a notified body instead, then the notified body, we have to inform market surveillance and the European Commission that a certificate was issued to a product when a harmonized standard did exist. Okay, so it doesn't make it CE certified. It doesn't make it certified to the RED. It's just a document to the manufacturer from the notified body to enable the manufacturer to sign their DOC. Market surveillance. Every EU member state must perform market surveillance. Of course, I spent the last 50 minutes telling you what you should do, but everybody always wants to know what's going to happen if they don't. So every EU member state must perform market surveillance, and that's typically done by them taking products from the marketplace without informing the manufacturer. Market surveillance is coordinated by a group called ADCO, which stands for Administrative Cooperation. And there's an ADCO for each of the directives, and so ADCO Red are the ones who are focusing on radio equipment. Every EU member state must participate in it, and they must report their findings to the European Commission. They're looking for formal non-compliances to the directive. And these can be admin or technical. So, for example, not CE marking the product correctly, or not including the manufacturer's name and address with the product correctly. Those are formal non-compliances, but they're admin issues. Or not having a risk assessment, or not having the declaration of conformity correctly. And then there's technical non-compliances, such as failing an emissions test or the output power being too high. There are targeted campaigns by ADCO. For example, they'll pick on a type of technology. In the past, we've seen them pick on PMR radio, 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, and most recently looking at radio modules in home appliance or home IoT equipment. And they communicate their findings with the FCC and with ISED Canada. So then, as a manufacturer, maintaining compliance once you have already put your product on the market. So you've already fully tested it, you've created your declaration of conformity, you understand the marketing requirements for CE marking and placing on the market, you understand what market surveillance are looking for, and you're selling your products. You always need to ensure that you're selling authorized devices. So each new unit must have its DOC, and that DOC must be up to date. As we mentioned, if the standard changes, you're going to have to reassess it. The DOC applies to each new unit that you supply, and the technical documentation must be up to date. So if market surveillance finds a unit on the market, they contact you and they give you the serial number of that product. They will ask you to send the technical documentation for that unit. And if you've been selling that model of product for a long time and the standards have changed, the documentation, of course, will have changed. And as a reminder, the manufacturer should be doing sample testing. So simply claiming you hadn't noticed that your products had gone out of compliance is not an excuse you can use. So tracking any changes, as I mentioned, you need to track any changes that you make to your product, changes that happen to the standards that you're using for your DOC, any changes to the regulation. So obviously when we went from the R&TTE directive to the radio equipment directive, that was one of the biggest changes we've seen recently. Or changes to how the equipment is used. You can imagine, for example, the mobile phone industry and RF exposure. Years ago, we all used to just hold a phone to our ears. And then after some time, we started carrying phones in a little holster on our belts. So that was a change in RF exposure conditions. Nowadays, I can't remember the last time I saw anybody carrying a phone on a holster on their belt. We carry them in our pockets directly against our body. So that's another change. So you have to look at how your product is being used. Your declaration of conformity to the RER covers your intended use and any reasonably foreseen use. If there are changes then, whether it's your change or the standards, what do? Well, you have to reassess. And you reassess your product based on the changes. So you will look at what the changes are and look at your product. Time to reopen your risk assessment and say, okay, what has changed and what do I need to reassess? It doesn't necessarily mean you need to do a full retest. For example, I mentioned that Wi-Fi and Bluetooth has a harmonized standard. They've had a harmonized standard for quite a long time. In fact, EN 300-328, version 2.1.1. That's been a harmonized standard for quite some time, and so your products may have been tested to that standard, and you might have a nice, pretty published test report from a test lab for that standard. However, a year or two ago, that standard got updated to version 2.2.2 of the standard, and the receiver blocking test got changed. Now, there are a lot of tests in that standard. Maybe there's 10 or 12 tests, and one of them has changed. So as a manufacturer, you need to look at that standard and say, well, is it a harmonized standard? And actually, now it is. Version 2.2.2 is a harmonized standard and has been for quite a few months now. In fact, the old version 2.1.1 will stop being a harmonized standard next month, August 2021. So you need to make sure that if you are still selling those 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi, Bluetooth and Zigbee devices, that you have reassessed them for the receiver blocking test, because you need evidence that you meet version 2.2.2. Now, that doesn't mean you need to go to a lab and say, please fully test to this new standard. You've got most of the tests still in your old original test report. You just need a test for this receiver blocking. And you need to go through the standard and do a side-by-side comparison and check that there's nothing else that's changed which could have affected you. The spurious emissions limits have changed, for example, but in most cases that doesn't necessarily recall a retest. And so the change has happened. You need to keep your documents up to date. That's your risk assessment, your technical documentation, and your DOC. So as a reminder then, you're going to develop your product. You assess it, or more likely test it. You label it with the CE mark. Maybe you get your type examination certificate if you need it or if you want it. You create a DOC. You maintain your technical documentation, and you watch for changes while your product's on the market. And if there are any changes, you return to the top of the list and start again. Okay, so that's the red. We'll come back to a little bit at the end, but I want to talk now about the UK. Well, actually, I want to talk about Great Britain. Hopefully you know the difference. So Great Britain is England, Wales, and Scotland. And the UK includes Northern Ireland. And so I'm going to talk about the UKCA requirements. We don't have much time at the end here, so I'm going to focus on the Britain requirements, which is the UKCA, and I'll explain what that's about. So we have the UK Radio Equipment Regulations, and there's the number of it. The compliance mark for the UKCA is the UKCA mark, or the UK Radio Regulations is the UKCA mark, and there it is. And it applies to radio equipment entering the UK market, or the British market, should I say, from the 1st of January 2021. Now, the reason I say British is because Northern Ireland is slightly different. For many, many political reasons involving the border between Northern Ireland and the country of Ireland, the Northern Ireland can either use the CE marking or a specific UK NI mark. So for the purpose of these slides, I'm talking about Britain, which is England, Scotland and Wales. I haven't yet come across a manufacturer asking me with a product that is intended for the Northern Ireland but is not for the EU. So most people are just using CE marking. Okay, so for Great Britain then, people can apply the UKCA mark from the 1st of January 2021. You should not have been using the UKCA mark before then. The UK has actually made a decision to continue accepting CE marked radio equipment for Britain until the 1st of January 2022. So right now, you can be CE marking your products for the EU and the UK will let them in. That isn't a trade deal between the UK or EU, it's a decision by the UK, and compliance in Britain will require the UKCA mark from the 1st of January 2022, unless, for example, the UK made the decision to extend their acceptance of CE marking. So the UK Radio Equipment Regulation has the same scope as the RED, the safety, EMC and radio performance. However, remember, it's a different country to the 27 countries in the EU. So as that first step of can it be placed on the market, you've done your assessment to decide if it can be placed on the market in the EU. Now you also need to check it can be placed on the market in Britain. The RED is a trade directive, of course, and the UK's radio regulations is a regulation for placing a radio onto the market in Britain. So the regulation is a trade document. Again, it's not a technical one. Again, it does include the same assessment of safety, EMC and radio. Again, it's declaration of conformity, just like the RED. And again, there is no certification. It covers product safety, EMC performance and radio performance, just exactly the same as the RED. There is some confusion or open questions, if you like, about those other categories, which are called Article 3.3 in the RED. Now, as we've seen, the connection to emergency services aspect in the RED has been enacted already, and we're expecting those other ones to be enacted in the EU soon. Well, in the UK, there isn't a direct comparison, and of course, an act being enabled in the EU does not mean anything to the UK's radio regulations. So that's an opportunity for a difference between the EU and UK requirements. So you have to ask if you can sell it in the UK. You need to check the UK's spectrum allocations. Of course, there isn't an Article 10.2 equivalent in the UK because that was checking a product can be used in at least one EU member state. Well, this is for Britain only, so you're just checking if it can only be used, if it can indeed be used in Britain or the UK. And of course, you don't need to list all of the different countries where a restriction exists. However, if there is a restriction to using it in the UK or Britain, then you do need to document that. You do need the alert little image on your packaging, and your user manual does need to state what the restriction of using it in Britain is. What standards should I test to? Well, again, ETSI and Senelec standards, just as with the RED. However, the European Official Journal of Harmonized Standards does not apply in Britain or the UK. So we have the UK Designated Standards list. At the moment, for radio equipment, the UK Designated Standards list matches the EU's Official Journal of Harmonized Standards. However, when we consider that the EU or the European Commission listing a standard means acceptance by 27 member states and a consultant, and they have no obligation to tell the UK when they're going to update their list, whereas the UK just has one country to make the decision and no consultant. So it's very easy to see in the future that the two standards lists will deviate. You may need a UK approved body, which has a similar role to the EU's notified body. And we are expecting to see some deviations turn up over the months and years. So again, it's DOC per product on the market. You're going to have to track the changes in the standards just as you would for the EU, because the UK's Declaration of Conformity, which of course is a different document to the EU Declaration of Conformity, would apply to each new unit. So now, as a compliance manager or as a manufacturer, you're going to be tracking your harmonized standards for Europe and your designated standards for the UK. Maybe they're changing at a similar rate, or maybe they won't. There's a UK approved body who can issue a certificate. So again, if the radio performance standard is not on the UK's designated standards list, then a UK approved body certificate is needed. And it's very similar to the EU's notified body. There is no formal agreement between UK approved bodies and EU notified bodies, but often you'll find that they're similar people or similar countries and companies, and often they'll be able to work together. Okay, so some final comments now about the whole topic of EU and UK compliance. Some common mistakes. Consistency of information. So if you're looking at your technical documentation file, the manufacturer is really responsible for the fact that the technical documentation file makes sense. If somebody looks at it, they should be able to see immediately that the product is compliant with the RED. And similarly, if you submit your product to a test lab, you fill in the application form for the test lab, it should all make sense. If your application form says it has one rated output power, but your user manual states a different power, and then your technical documentation of your RF chip states a different power again, how are you showing consistency that you understand your product? Not understanding the basic requirements is a really common mistake. So people really waiting to sit there now saying, what do you mean there's a change to a harmonized standard? What do you mean I've got to do receiver blocking test before August? This basic concept of keeping an eye on the standards changes, maintaining your risk assessment at all times. Not testing. I said that you don't have to test, but you are strongly encouraged to. Sometimes people will say, well, I couldn't find the standard to cover that, so I assumed there wasn't a standard, and therefore I assumed I didn't have to test. Well, that's not correct. If there isn't a standard, it means that you have to go and find some other way of assessing your product. Guessing worst case, this is always something I put on my common mistakes slides. I imagine I've seen it done so many times. You've got a range of 8 or 9 or 10 different units in your product family range, and a group of people sit around in an office trying to guess which one would be the worst case. When actually, if we could guess the worst case mode of products without testing, well, if I knew how to do that, I'd be a wealthy man. Lack of communication between all of the parts. So if you go to a test lab and you say, I want you to test this product, speak to the test lab first, explain your product exactly, try not to hold things back, make sure you communicate early with the lab and the notified body, and make sure everybody knows what's going on. Wrong company, wrong role. So the manufacturer is responsible for making all these decisions. But of course, in most cases, the test lab has all the knowledge. But a test lab's job is to test what they're told to test and issue a test report. So for example, if you've got two models and you test one of them, the test lab should report that they tested that one. They should not say, we tested one and we think both would comply. So the test lab needs to remember their responsibilities, and the manufacturer needs to remember their responsibility is to make the legal decisions and tell the test lab exactly what to test. Another common mistake is thinking this is simple. People have a simple product, like a monitor I have on my desk in front of me. That's a pretty simple product. It's not radio enabled. It's a piece of electronic device. You could probably assess it for safety and EMC and be pretty confident it complies. But people come along with a product, it's multimedia, it has main supplies, it has LTE modules, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, and a carrying strap so it could be held against the body, and they think it's a difficult product. They think it's a simple product. It's not a simple product, it's a difficult product. Testing is difficult and the compliance is difficult, and don't expect it to be too simple. And misinformation. You can look on the internet or speak to people who don't know what they're doing and get all sorts of wrong advice. So be careful with that. And okay, finally then, before we move to the questions, I will leave you with this final thought. If you take a piece of radio equipment and you have CE marked your radio equipment, and you've also got some other equipment, whether it's radio or not, and that's CE marked, and you place your radio permanently inside that other equipment and then put the other product on the market, you have created a whole new piece of radio equipment. I'm reminded of the old statement, CE plus CE does not equal CE. And I mention that here simply because 1 week from today, we have our webinar on this very topic, radio modules. So radio modules is any type of radio equipment that you put inside another thing, and we'll cover that for the Radio Equipment Directive next week, and we'll touch also on the UK's requirements. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is part 3 of our 4-part webinar. All of them are available for catch-up watching if you missed the FCC and ISED webinars already, or if you'd like to watch them again. You can contact me or Laura for that sort of information. And now I'd like to say thank you very much. My name was Michael Darby, and now I will ask if there are any questions. So I will hand back to Laura and we will have a look at the question and answers and see if we have anything. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for going over those. We've actually got quite a few questions submitted by our attendees. So if you're okay to take a look and go through some of those, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, great. I will do my best. Right, okay, thanks everybody for listening. Let's have a little look at this. It's quite a long list of questions. So so here's a first question. My answer is I don't really know, which is good. I never mind admitting that I don't know something. So is the UK legally requiring the DOC to be provided to the end user in the same way as the EU does? My guess would be yes. So as you may know, with the Radio Equipment Directive, the declaration of conformity must go with the product. Under the old RER directive, it had to physically go with the product. With the RED, you have the choice. You can either supply the full declaration of conformity with the product, or on the user manual, for example, you can make a simple statement in each European language that the product does comply with the RED, and here's a link to the DOC. So the actual physical DOC doesn't necessarily need to go with the radio, but a statement of compliance would go with the radio and a link to your manufacturer's website, and it shouldn't be buried deep down. It should be very easy for the user or the end owner of your product to click on that and see the DOC that relates to that product. My guess is that the UK requirement is exactly the same, because the UK radio regulations is really a bit of a copy and paste of the Radio Equipment Directive. But that said, I remember reading through the UK regulations, and I can't sit here and say, yes, I've seen the clause that says it must be. So I would recommend do it, because I think you're meant to. But I can't remember reading a clause that specifically states you have to for the UK. Will the slides or recording be available? The recording will. I don't know if there's a plan to share the slides. My slides tend to be just bullet points. And then I just ramble for an hour, really. But I believe that the recording is on YouTube, and I believe that all 4 of these webinars are on YouTube. So the existing 2 for the FCC and FCC modules, and now this one, will also be recorded and available. And then next week's on radio modules in the EU, that will be available. So I believe Laura will send out a link to the recordings. Okay, if an RF module in my pump is already approved to the RED, will the pump be automatically become RED compliant? No. As that last slide said, if you've got a radio, we will go through this in great detail next week, but basically, spoiler alert, there is no such thing as a radio module compliance for the EU. With the FCC presentations, we talked about a special type of authorization like modular approval, which is different to a normal radio certification. For the EU, you just CE mark radios. And so if somebody's selling a radio module, they CE mark the radio module so that they can sell it. But it's just a radio. And if you take a CE marked radio, whether it's big or small, and you install it into your product, you've got a whole new product, and you are the new manufacturer of that exciting new radio equipment. And the approval, the CE mark of the module isn't transferable, unless, of course, your product happens to be a test jig identical to the one that the module manufacturer tested the module on, but very unlikely. What about products for automotive? Are they excluded because they are type approved already? No. Well, so here's a very interesting topic. Some vehicles, like motor cars, are type approved. Now, I just said about 10 seconds ago that if you take a CE marked radio and you put it into something else, then the end thing becomes a CE marked radio. So if you have a type approved car, then that does not apply because the car is type approved. So if you've got a radio, I don't know, like an infotainment system or a radar in a bumper or whatever, and that's CE marked, and you put it in a type approved car, then it remains legally separate from the car, and it remains a radio product. The car itself doesn't become CE marked to the RED. However, if it isn't a type approved car, if it's some other type of vehicle like a bike or a big digger, then you end up with a CE marked radio equipment that you can drive around in. But yeah, you still need to assess that radio equipment. Yeah, there was a clarification about if you're putting a product together, if you're the one soldering components together, the legal manufacturer is the end company that has their name on the product, and they're the ones who put the product on the market. Yes, there is a link to the recordings of the previous webinars. Do I need a declaration of conformity if I'm going to trial maybe 100 users? Well, this is an interesting thing. So there's placing a product on the market, and then there's putting a product into service. Now, if you're going to put a product on the market, it means you're making it available for somebody else. They don't have to buy it. They have to be available to them. So if you're going to make one product and give it to somebody else to use, or sell it to somebody else, or you're giving it to them under some, you know they'll buy loads if they like it, that sort of thing, then you've put it on the market because you've made it available for someone else, and they're going to go off and start using it. So you need to be CE marking that, because you've lost control of it, and that's whether it's one of them or 100 of them or whatever. If you yourself as the manufacturer have not placed the product on the market, but you want to do some field trials of the product, or you want to take it to a trade show, and whether this is a 1 unit or 10 units or 100 units, you're not placing it on the market, so you don't have to CE mark it, but you do still have to ensure that it is, because you're going to place it into service, you're going to turn it on, you have to make sure it's compliant. So for example, it can't kill your employee who's using it, it can't interfere with other equipment, and it's not CE marked. If you take it to a trade show or something and you're using it, you have to be ready to turn it off if you suddenly need to, like for example if it does cause interference. So above the red and above all those CE marking directives, there's a document called the Blue Guide. Red sounds like a color, but it isn't. Blue Guide, like the color. If you type in to Google or any other search engine, the Blue Guide EU, it will come up as a free document, and it's like a really high level document all about CE marking, market surveillance, and it covers the CE marking aspects for all of the directives. So that will be where it says how big the CE mark should be, and that's where it says what to do about trade shows, and that's where it says, I said that the declaration of conformity and the compliance applies to each individual unit. So if you place that unit on the market and then 6 months later it breaks, and you take it back to the UK or wherever, mend it, and then give it back to your customer, you're not placing it back on the market. It was already on the market. You've just repaired it. All of that's explained in the Blue Guide. Okay. Does the red apply to medical devices? Yes, it does. So if you have a radio-enabled medical device, then you need to think about the radio performance and the radio equipment directive and the medical device. And if it comes under, if it's within the scope of the medical device directive or medical device regulations, then you're going to have parallel regulations. And this is an interesting thing, when we talk about safety and EMC of radio equipment, some people just get kind of hung up on, well, my radio must be tested to common radio standards. So for example, you'd say EN 301489 for EMC, and EN 62368-1 is a common safety standard for radio equipment. Well, actually, it's a multimedia safety standard, or it's a hazard-based standard for multimedia equipment. If your radio is a medical device, then actually your safety standard and your EMC, your radio link would probably be assessed to EN 301489, but you'd also be looking at EMC and safety standards like EN 60601-1-2. So you've got to think about all the requirements. Does the contact information need to be on the product and the packaging? Yeah, so a lot of companies are getting into a lot of trouble with market surveillance at the moment for not having the manufacturer's details on there. That would be a formal non-compliance to not have the manufacturer's details. The requirement is to have it on the product, unless the product is too small, in which case it can be on the packaging. And it doesn't give a dimension, so each manufacturer is making their own decision about what is too small. Looking at my phone, it doesn't have the manufacturer's address on it, for example. So the manufacturer's name and details. If market surveillance find your product on the market and they pick it up from the shelves of a shop and they go and test it, and they have a problem with it, they need to be able to look at the product or the packaging or the documentation with it, and they need to be able to find you, your address, and they need to tell you what the model of the product is and maybe the serial number if necessary. What level of EMC testing is required within the RED? Okay, so that's the EMC directive does not apply to radio equipment, but EMC assessment is necessary, and it's kind of considered equivalent to the EMC directive. So you would expect to do all of the applicable EMC emissions and immunity. And if you've got a multimedia device with radio, then you're going to do your EMC testing, and while you're testing it, you're going to be assessing the radio link works okay, and you're going to be assessing the multimedia operations works okay. And if you can do those at the same time, great. If you can't do them at the same time, or if you've got so many modes that you can't assess them all, then you might end up doing different tests. But those standards, they tend to call up the same, you know, the multimedia EMC standard and the radio EMC standard, they both call up an ESD test, and they both call up a radiated immunity test. So you'll do those same tests. And if it's medical, again, you'll do those same tests. Interesting thing about medical, if you look at 60601-1-2, the EMC immunity levels, like ESD, for example, they're higher levels. And so you would do the whole product, including the radio link, to those higher levels. So you're looking at the EMC requirements are thorough and complete, just as if you had been applying the EMC directive. And it covers everything. It doesn't just cover the RED, doesn't just cover the radio part. The RED covers the whole product. So your EMC assessment isn't just of the radio part, it's of the radio part, sure, but of everything else too. There are specific requirements in the UK for road traffic EMC. Okay, how do we assure these elements are covered when someone produces a DOC with a RED? There are specific requirements in the UK. Well, it sounds like something that is either in the standard or the manufacturer has to do in their risk assessment. Now, the risk assessment, you know, this is a document a lot of people struggle with. I'm actually writing a paper to explain risk assessments at the moment, and hopefully that will be useful. If your product is intended for an environment and those standards don't appear to be there, then you're still responsible for assessing it. Probably the most common example that gets dragged up is solar panel converters, or the electronics of a solar panel. The EMC emissions test, spurious emissions, starts from 150 kilohertz and goes up. And those things are known to cause interference below 150 kilohertz. They have high emissions and they interfere with stuff. So as a manufacturer of those products, if you fully apply the harmonized standards, you pass. But you know it causes interference because everyone says so. So you are responsible for doing more testing and more fixing to make sure it brings down the emissions, even though the standard didn't cover it. You know, that makes sense. Will this webinar be on YouTube? Yes. I don't think that makes me an influencer. I think I'm too old and boring for that. How can I take a module onto the market without an antenna? Okay, so the word module doesn't need to be there because the word module doesn't mean much in the radio equipment directive sense. So let's rephrase that. How can I put radio equipment on the market without an antenna? It's possible. You know, anything, a radio equipment CE marked, you don't have to have the power supply, you don't have to have the antenna, you don't have to have data. The radio manufacturer or the module manufacturer needs to demonstrate that the module or the radio complies with the requirements. So most likely they will have used an antenna during their assessment, certainly for the EMC immunity tests, for example, and the radiated tests maybe for the radio. So they will have assessed their radio with an antenna, and then they would sell it without an antenna, and their declaration of conformity and user manual would state which antenna that radio is compliant with. If an end company wants to use a different antenna, then that's going to be something that they've got to try and figure out with the manufacturer, or they're modifying the radio and then they become the manufacturer. Okay, after Brexit, the manufacturer is no longer within the EU, correct? What is required to use an importer to supply the EU to the EU market? So yes, so the manufacturer, the UK is not in the EU anymore, same as if China or America. So the manufacturer always has to put their name and address on their product or packaging, and then when it arrives in the EU, the importer's name and address gets added. Now, if the manufacturer knows who the importer is, then they can already have labeled their packaging, or they can put the importer's name on the DOC or the user manual or whatever. But if it isn't known, then the importer will need to stick their details to the packaging of the product when it arrives. Okay. If the company address is too long to be placed on the product label, what should the manufacturer do? So if the company's name and address won't fit on the product, company's name, try and get that on if you can, but ultimately it could be on the packaging, user manual, things like that. Could it be on a QR code on the product? I've never seen anything in the EU that says a QR code is okay, and I would recommend against it. For example, if you've got a product with a screen, like a cell phone, CE marking, an E-label CE marking is not permitted with the EU, and I've never seen anything that permits a QR code. QR codes are okay for Canada, by the way, but not for the EU. And so I would say anything that risks slowing your product down at customs is a bad idea. Do test reports proving product compliance need to be produced by test labs who are accredited by notified bodies? No. So for the RED and the UK, you do not need an accredited lab. You're recommended to find a good lab, certainly, but for either of those markets, you do not need an accredited test lab. And it says accredited by notified bodies. Notified bodies never accredit test labs. Notified bodies only ever review products. Accreditation bodies accredit test labs. Under the new EU market surveillance regulation, do the DOCs have to be serialized? No. And I think I mentioned serial numbers, but the only reason I mentioned that was, let's say you put a product on the market, has its DOC, maybe your DOC is on your website, and you sell a load of them, and then you stop selling them, and the DOC remains, and that's fine. Doesn't need any mention of the serial number. The only thing would be, let's say you've got a Bluetooth product right now, and you're selling it, and you've got the EN300 328 version 2.1.1 product standard, and the DOC is going out with all those radios, and around about now you've got 1 month before that standard changes, or the deadline, the end date of that standard changing. Let's say around now you start putting new units on the market, and they give the version 2.2.2 of the Bluetooth standard. So suddenly you've got 2 different DOCs, and one of the DOCs applies to all the units you put on the market until now, and the other DOC applies to all the units that you will put on the market from now. And then maybe in a year from now, that standard changes again. And so you could have a 3rd DOC. Maybe the EMC standard changes, a 4th DOC. So over 4 years of selling a product, you could have 4 or 5 different DOC options that apply depending on which unit it is. And if market surveillance call you up and go, where's the DOC for this product? If you only give them the latest one and they go, but it's been on the market for 2 years, but we've got it in our hands, you need to know which DOC applied to that one on that date. Serial numbers might be a way of achieving that. For the shortened version of the DOC, is it permitted under the UK radio regulations to do the same? I assume so. Again, I couldn't find it in the UK radio regulations. The RED says you either have the full DOC with the product or you can have a shortened one. The UK radio regulations just say that the manufacturer must draw up a declaration of conformity. And I haven't seen anything that says that the user has to be provided with that, and I similarly haven't seen anything to say that shortened version is allowed. So maybe I'll check into that. So there's quite a lot of technical information in the user manuals, such as the power and the frequency. Those documents are now live, hosted on our website. How do we present these in our technical folder? Good question. I don't think the writers of the RED cared to worry too much about how you do it, just that you must do it. So for example, if Market Surveillance Authority asks you for your technical documentation, they're asking you for the user manual, maybe you're sending them a document or maybe you're sending them a link. Is it possible to use EU standards to show compliance with UKCA? Not even ETSI standards. Not 100% sure I understand the question, but yeah, use European standards. There are no UK specific standards. There are BSEN, so British Standards EN standards, but what they are is if Senelec, and they do the standards for safety and EMC, if Senelec issue standards, that's like 55032, 35 or 32, or any of the safety ones, BSI in the UK reissues them BSEN, and you may or may not choose to put the BS in front of it, but the ETSI standards, they don't. So you wouldn't put BS in front of that because BSEN 300-328 doesn't exist. It's not a document. So for UKCA testing, yeah, you're based with using those ETSI and Senelec standards, which are EN standards. Not specifically European standards, but they are, well, I guess they are EN. We produce a radio product in Europe. A company in the UK buys the product to sell in the UK. They import it to the UK. Must the name and address of the importer also be added to the product label, or can the accompanying documents, which of course is preferred by us? So a product is manufactured in Europe. A company in the UK buys the product. So it's imported into the UK, and then the company in the UK sells it in the UK. So if the company in the UK rebrands it, then they become the manufacturer and they place it on the market in the UK. So they're not an importer, they're a manufacturer at that point. If they buy it, place it on the market with the European manufacturer's name on it, then the UK company is just an importer at that point, I think. The name and the address of the importer must be added to the product label. Product or the packaging, doesn't have to be the product. Or can it be on the accompanying documents? Yes, that is correct. I don't think I've ever seen an importer's name and address put on the actual product. Usually it's on the documentation or the packaging. On the UKCA DOC, can we mention the EN standards? Yes, you can. Or must it be the BSEN standard? If it's a Senelec standard that they have that BSI has converted to BSEN, then feel free to do that, but you don't have to. If it's the ETSI standard, then do not put BS because ETSI is the only version. And yes, you list all the EN standards. Look on the UK's designated standard list, and there they all are. They're the ETSI standards listed there. Those are the ones to use. The standard you need is not on the UK designated standards list, then just use an appropriate ETSI or Senelec EN standard. Where to find a good example of a risk assessment document as an example? That's a good question. I created one just the other day because lots of people are asking. So there isn't a template and there isn't a standard example, because it's not like, if you come from the safety world, you'll know a risk assessment like a block with risks and how likely it is to happen, and you'll have green blocks and orange blocks and red blocks. That's not really what they're looking for. They're looking for more like a summary of your compliance journey. Like if you've used non-harmonized standards, or if you've installed a radio module and decided to trust some results from the module, or if you've got a product where the standard doesn't fully cover it. They're looking for you to have described and explained all those things. So it's like, dear diary, day 3, I realized my drone flies near overhead electrical cables to look for heat spots. So I chose to test magnetic radiated immunity on it. That's not in the standard, but that's what you chose to do. So that's where you would describe those sort of things. So there can't be a template for that sort of thing. However, people are so confused that I am creating a very basic template, and so I'll try and share that around. The radio part is clear that it's wise to use harmonized standards. What about the EMC and safety part in the red? So yeah, EMC and safety in the red, if you can, use harmonized standards. The funny, not funny part of that is there aren't very many harmonized standards for the red, for safety and EMC. There's RF exposure standards, so that's safety, but product safety, EN 62368, is not yet listed. So you'd have to find the appropriate safety standard, which isn't harmonized, apply it, test to it, and then document in your risk assessment why you chose to do that. And the same with EMC. So you would find the right EN 301-489- whatever, and you would maybe, if your product does other things, like if it's a washing machine, EN 55014, you find the standards. You can go and look at the official journal for the EMC directive and the low voltage directives, and you can borrow standards from them. That's a good idea to do. That doesn't make them harmonized for the RED, but it's a good place to find standards. And if you haven't used harmonized standards for the safety in EMC, you do not have to use a notified body. You can do, but you do not have to. Must the applied standards for safety in EMC be harmonized under the RED? No, but it'd be nice if they would. Must they be harmonized under the low voltage directive and EMC directive? No, the low voltage directive and EMC directive have no relationship. You know, then they don't relate to compliance with the RED. 5 years ago, under the old R and TTE directive, if a standard was harmonized for the low voltage directive or harmonized for the EMC directive, a manufacturer could consider them harmonized for the R and TTE directive. But that ended 5 years ago when the R and TTE directive ended. Now, the only standards that are harmonized for the RED are the ones on the RED official journal. So taking a standard from the EMC directive official journal or low voltage directive official journal is a good idea, but doesn't make them harmonized for the RED. And state-of-the-art standards. Yeah, if you've got a standard which isn't harmonized, I would just say try and use the latest published version. Why was a carry strap mentioned in the comment about difficult tests? Don't remember. Maybe it's because it makes it a portable device and therefore RF exposure next to the body. Rebranding and compliance responsibility. If we are rebranding, basically, if the name on the product is changed, is it considered rebranding? Yeah. So if you take off the original manufacturer's name and put on your name, then you are rebranding it. One thing we do see often is the original manufacturer's name remains on the product, like manufactured by XYZ, name and address, blah, 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 and then it's got some other company's name which looks more like a branding or model number. People try and do that, and it seems to work okay. But if you are taking off some other company's name and putting your company's name on such that it looks like you are the manufacturer, looks like your product, you are the manufacturer, you do the DOC. We only sell business to business. Does each product need a DOC and user manual? Yes, even business to business is mandatory placing on the market, so it must be CE marked and DOC. If a company is servicing a product CE marked under an older harmonized standard, does returning the service product to the market? No, actually, I already mentioned that, I think. Yeah, so when it talks about a product first being placed on the market, so somebody asked me recently, the directive talks about when a product is first placed on the market, and they said, what if one boat goes off to France and one boat goes to the Netherlands, and they've both got a container of my products in? When is the product first placed on the market? The answer is to remember the fact that the DOC applies to an individual unit. So those individual units in France were first placed on the market then. And those individual units were first placed on the market in the Netherlands then. Now, if one of those units is on the market and then it's removed to be repaired and sent back again, it was already on the market. So it does not need to be reassessed to the latest standard. You can send it back to the user without having to reassess it. Is there a blue guide for the UKCA regulations? No, there isn't. And of course, the blue guide is for the EU. And so there are a lot of things in the blue guide that people selling into the UK or GB want to apply, like this trade show bit, like the whole repair and replace thing, where people are saying, so is that the same for the UK? don't know. So there's still a lot that is unclear. How would you define the scope of network in Article 3.3D in terms of potential new cybersecurity requirements? Right, we have to wait until that's defined because there are a lot of suggestions about what this cybersecurity will mean. Cybersecurity, for example, you know, the people who are writing the regulations, they're thinking about, okay, something that is connected to the internet. So a mobile phone, okay, it's always connected to the internet, so it'd be very easy for somebody to hack a mobile phone because it's connected to the internet. Or what about when you're in your home and your phone's using Wi-Fi? Your Wi-Fi is your own private network. So is your Wi-Fi connected to the public network, but your product in your home is only connected to your private network? Where does the link end? But then when you really take a step back and say, where did this whole conversation about cybersecurity start? We start looking back at things like sports watch GPS trackers so you know where somebody is, or baby monitors and baby monitors with cameras, where people used to hack into baby monitors to be able to know if a house was empty or not. And these are not network connected devices at all. So the scope of the cybersecurity requirements are yet to be defined. We expect them to be defined very soon. Then once they're defined, they can send a standardization request to ETSI. How do I get onto the next webinar? I guess look out for the link on LinkedIn, things like that. Does Element offer a heads-up notification service for changing standards? I think we do. I feel like we've talked about this within Element. I don't know. I like to think that we do tell people when standards get updated. For regard to the market surveillance, do they need to post to have the economic operator or authorized entity? That's a good question. Does the authorized representative information need to be with the product for the EU? If your manufacturer is outside the EU and you haven't got an importer in the EU and you've chosen to use the authorized representative in the EU instead, then yeah, you're going to need to somehow tell people who that company is. So that information would need to be with the product. If the responsibility of proving RED compliance is with the final product manufacturer, why should the component manufacturer prove RED compliance as well? Yeah, so like if you make a radio module, why is module CE marked? That is, I think, the question. So if you make a radio module and you CE mark it, and then somebody else buys the module and puts it in, they become the manufacturer. Why did they bother? Two things. Firstly, you're more likely to buy it if it's CE marked. Secondly, if they want to sell that module to companies in the EU, let's say you're a manufacturer in Germany and you're going to have a final product, you've got your host thing and you want to buy a module, and the module manufacturer wants to sell it to you, and the module manufacturer might be in Europe or might not be in Europe, and the module manufacturer has this module and they want to sell it to you, business to business, for you to install in your product. They can't sell it to you if it's not CE marked, because they are placing radio equipment on the market. If the module manufacturer was in the USA and they wanted to sell to a company in the USA or China or UK that was outside the EU, they could do that without the CE mark on the module because they're all outside the EU. But if they want to sell the module to companies in the EU, then it must be CE marked as a module to allow it to be sold. And then when you install it, the CE mark is effectively gone. And also, of course, you're more likely to buy it because if you buy a CE marked module, then you know the module manufacturer has performed a load of tests, radio performance tests. Maybe they'll even give you their test report, and that could save you some time if you decide to trust their test results. Right. What is meant? Oh, hang on. My product is component that I think I've answered that. Okay, yeah, apparently the shortened version of the DOC is okay for the UKCA, so that does suggest that the DOC does need to be with the product. With the right to repair coming into force in the next few years, will all spare parts also have to meet the CE directives individually? Good question, James. I don't know. Let me have a look at that. If a harmonized standard is many years old and the tests in the standard are clearly out of date, should we still use this standard or work to the latest non-harmonized standards? If there's a harmonized standard and it's on the official journal and the testing is old and out of date, and there's a new draft standard which you think is most appropriate for your product, that's a good question. What do you do? Legally, I would say use the harmonized standard because that is the right thing to do. But if you genuinely feel that the standard doesn't give you good confidence that your product will comply in today's marketplace, then apply the harmonized standard so that you don't need a notified body and you have presumption of conformity. And then in your risk assessment, tell yourself that standard's harmonized, but it's a bit rubbish. So go and look at the draft standard, the new draft one, and pick out the new tests from there and do them so that you are completely covered. The alternative option is to forget the old harmonized standard, just go only to the new draft standard, fully apply that, but then you've got to get a notified body certificate, and the notified body would have to say, well, there was a harmonized standard, but you chose not to apply it. So I have to tell market surveillance and the European Commission that you did that. So I would say apply the harmonized standard, give yourself presumption of conformity, and then go and look at those new tests to see if you think you ought to be doing those as well. And a product sent to the UK this year with CE label to a system integrator. This is fine. The integrator selling it next year to a final customer. Must the UKCA be applied, or is the CE still fine? So if it's like you've got to think about when the individual radio is first placed on the market. Now, I'll talk a lot about modules, obviously, but let's say, for example, you're just looking at the EU. You have a radio module right now, Bluetooth radio module, tested to version 2.1.1 of the Bluetooth standard, and you sell it to somebody right now, which you can do. They integrate it into their product. By the time they've finished integrating it, it's end of August. They go to put their radio product on the market. They need to do that new blocking test because their radio product is entering the market under version 2.2.2 of the harmonized standard, which the module manufacturer didn't do, or maybe didn't do. Maybe they have done, but if they didn't, if you buy in a module, put it in your product, and then you place your radio on the market and the harmonized standard has changed, you've got to think about the standard when you place your final radio on the product. Similarly, you could put a radio module into the UK market right now with a CE mark on it. Some UK company buys it, integrates it into their product, and then they go to put it on the market, but it's January 2022. They're going to have to do this UKCA declaration of their product. The testing is all going to be very similar, by the way, whether they do UKCA. Remember that the CE mark of the module is irrelevant at that point. How about selling refurbished products to a new user? That would be in the blue guide, I suspect, and I'd have to have a look at that. I'm going to say that it's probably, if it's refurbished, I don't want to guess. I'll have a look, or feel free to look in the blue guide. The DOC needs to be applied to every unit that you sell. Yeah. Can the DOC be I declare a product name X, model name Y, serial number 0 to 1000 are compliant? Or do I need to make a separate DOC for each serial number? You don't need to list the serial number on your DOC. I only mentioned the serial number on the DOC because if over the series of a lifetime of a product, you've got lots of different DOCs, you need to know which one applies. So if you keep good records, then that's fine. You know, if market surveillance comes and says, I've got serial number 703, and you can go and look on your records and say, this DOC applies. It hasn't got a serial number on it, but I know it applies, trust me. Then that's okay. It doesn't need to have the serial number. But yeah, if you're going to put the serial number on it, then I would, let's say, for example, you're selling products and you get to product number 1000, and then a new standard exists. So from 1001 onwards, you've got a new DOC. If you are putting the serial numbers on your DOCs, then yeah, on your previous ones, you could put up to 1000, you know, 0 to 1000. And then from there, you could put from 1000 onwards, but you don't know where it's going to end. So maybe it's better to just be a bit organized with your paperwork. Is it okay to use a standard that has a newer version, for example, a new version published by ETSI, newer than the one on the official journal? And would the notified body be okay with that? It is okay. There's nothing to stop you doing that, but some things to be careful about. So here, imagine this situation. Okay, so a radio standard comes out and it's listed on the official journal. So it's a harmonized standard. Let's call that version 1, just to make it easier. So that's version 1 is on the official journal. Now ETSI publish version 2. Version 2 is published by ETSI, but it's not on the official journal yet. If you want to use it, you can use it, but you would have to go to a notified body because it's not a harmonized standard. And if you go to a notified body and they'll issue you a certificate to that, most likely, depending on what the changes are. If ETSI have just like taken all the tests out, for example, the notified body may say, I don't like this new standard, it's no good, it doesn't meet the directive, and that might well be why it's not harmonized yet. If the new version of the standard is already quite old, like if the harmonized version is old and the new version is old, but the oldest one is harmonized, then you got to think, well, what's wrong with this new one? Why doesn't the European Commission want it? So it's not straightforward. But let's say it's just a new version of a standard that's just come out and you really want to use it, you can go to a notified body. One thing to be careful of, though, is, as I mentioned in the slides, if there is a harmonized standard, but you choose to use a different one, the notified body can issue the certificate to you, but then they have to inform the European Commission and market surveillance that they issued that certificate to you for your product. And partly it's just to make market surveillance aware that you're out there using a non-harmonized standard when a harmonized standard did exist. But also, I think if every notified body was sending that kind of certificate in every day, then the Commission might say, well, there must be something wrong with the harmonized standard then. So yes, you can do it. Now, for something like EMC and safety, the EMC and safety standards are not listed on the official journal yet. So if they will be. So you're always encouraged to use the latest one. Now, one interesting point that came out of one of the questions this morning. So let's say, for example, the harmonized standard on the official journal is quite old. And you know, as a manufacturer, that it's really not good enough. And so ETSI publishes a brand new standard, version 2, and you know it is good enough. It deals with all the latest developments in the technology, and you know it's a good standard. And so that one, as an engineer, you know that's the best one, but legally the harmonized one. My recommendation in that situation would be to fully apply the harmonized standard so that you've got presumption of conformity and you don't need a notified body if you want to avoid that. But in addition, when you're doing your risk assessment, look at those new tests in the new standard and go, I'm going to choose to do those as well to make sure I'm fully covered. And that way, when the version 2 standard does eventually become harmonized, you've done all the work anyway. Okay, so that was that. Hopefully that's a good answer. So with regard to EN 300-328 version 2.2.2, this is the new version. If the product is already on the market, so it's not in the factory, is the manufacturer responsible for retesting and re-evaluation as per the latest standard? If So the units, the individual units, like the individual ones that you could pick up and hold, they're already on the market. If you've stopped selling it, if you've placed a load of them on the market, let's say 1,000 of them on the market already, and then your marketing group, your boss says, we don't need to sell anymore, we're done, we're finished, and then the standard changes, then you've got 300, 328 version 2.2.2. You're not selling new units, you don't need to recall the ones that are on the market, so you don't need to do anything. But if you wish then to keep selling some new units, new versions of that model, then you do need to retest. You do need to check that blocking test, because even if you've already placed some units on the market of that model, those ones are gone, but any new units, new samples of that product, if you want to keep placing new samples on the market, then you do need to retest those new ones before they go on the market. And if they fail, for example, and if you have to modify them, then it's only those ones you have to modify. You don't need to recall the ones that are on the market. You'd have the modified ones to meet the new standard that you would then sell. Okay, what is my definition of a certificate or certification? As you have highlighted that a DOC is not a certification process. Okay, certification is kind of like a form of registration of a product. So if we look, for example, at the FCC certification, the FCC certification is based around, for example, does it pass some tests? Does it meet the rules? Does it have the right antenna? Are the user manual statements correct? Is the labeling correct? It's an assessment of the product, but the certification process is registering it with the FCC or registering it with ISAID Canada. So for the FCC and Canada, with a transmitter, you are certifying it through a certification body. And then once it's certified, somebody else has kind of legally taken some responsibility there, and it's registered with that authority. With the DOC and the Radio Equipment Directive, there is no certification. You don't have to register it with anybody. But in the case of non-harmonized standards use, you'd need to get a certificate from a notified body where they reviewed it. It's not being registered with the EU, for example, it's just being reviewed by the notified body, and they are issuing their own certificate to you to say, we have viewed your product's documents, we've reviewed all the technical aspects of your product, we think that your product meets the requirement of the Radio Equipment Directive. So it's a certificate from the notified body to the manufacturer to say, we think you should go for it, or we think you can go for it. Certification, on the other hand, is more like registering your product. So with the EU, you might get a certificate from the notified body, but that is a proper legal certificate, and it's a proper certificate to the directive, but then you still have to do your DOC. And be careful, by the way, there are some test labs who might give a shortened, like a one-page certificate to say, we tested your product and here's our certificate to say it passes. There's nothing in the red to allow for that, by the way. And if you get something like that, make sure it's quite clear that that's them just saying it passed some tests. A test lab that isn't a notified body isn't able to say that it meets the directive, for example. Okay, so EU Class 2 devices. Where can someone find the non-harmonized frequency bands for the European area? Different regulations for the different EU countries. That's a good question. So each individual EU member state has its own frequency allocation table. Just as, you know, if they suddenly made a compliance solution for North America, you'd still have the FCC and Canada as separate countries. In the EU, each different country has got its own frequency allocation tables. And it used to be, years ago, you'd have to go to each EU country and get their own frequency allocation tables. And you can still do that if you wish to do it. But there's a sort of overarching or overreaching group called CEPT. And this is the sort of European Post and Telecom group. And they deal with things like spectrum planning and spectrum allocations all around Europe, including the EU, which is a group within Europe. And so the CEPT, you know, there's somebody you would speak to with regard to spectrum planning if you had a new type of product. But they also speak to every EU country, and they organize all of the frequency allocation tables. So they ask each country to send in their frequency allocation details. And they have created a website, and it's called EFIS, Electronic Frequency Information System. So if you search on efis.dk, because they're based in Denmark, search on efis.dk, and it comes up, and it's part of this group CEPT. And then you can search on each different country, or you can do a whole search on the European Union. So you could type in your frequency band, and it would tell you which countries allow it, or you could type in a frequency band and you could see which types of technology allow it. Now, in addition to that, if you go to the European Commission's website, then you can go to the Radio Equipment Directive page, and there's a link to Class 1 devices. Class 1 devices can be placed on the market without restriction. Class 2 devices are not Class 1. So you couldn't have a definitive list of Class 2 devices, because any new thing you think of could be Class 2. So that list would be impossible to write. But the Class 1 list would be there. So let's say you have your radio and you operate it in a frequency band. If you look for the Class 1 list and it's there, then you know that frequency band is harmonized. If it isn't on the Class 1 list, then it might not be a harmonized frequency band. Then you could go to EFIS, search on that frequency band, and find out if all countries allow it. If it's a short-range device, like a low-power short-range device, there's a very useful document called Recommendation 70-03. It's a recommendation document, and as the name suggests, and at the back of it, it lists all frequency bands for short-range devices and which countries implement it. It's just a guidance, but that's a very, very useful document. Okay, if we have a product which we will add GSM or Wi-Fi module, so now this is a radio product, yes. In the DOC for this product, shall I be listing just the red and not the EMC and low voltage directive? Correct. So as soon as you put that module into your product, the EMC directive and low voltage directive do not apply to your product. The radio equipment directive applies to your product. When you're listing your standards, you'll list the safety test standards under Article 3.1a of the RED, EMC standards under Article 3.1b of the RED, radio standards Article 3.2 of the RED. You will not reference the EMC directive and low voltage directive because they don't apply. If so, shall I do the same for the UKCA DOC? Yes, exactly. So for the UKCA, you're declaring to the radio regulations, which includes safety and EMC. You don't need to reference the other regulations. Okay, good. Technical assessment of a radio often requires special RF test modes and or firmware, correct. How does market surveillance perform a technical assessment of a radio without contacting the manufacturer for test instructions? That's a good question. Actually, years ago, I worked for a test lab, and one of our biggest customers was a spectrum authority in the EU. They used to just go around the shops, buy up loads of products, and put them all in massive boxes and ship them to us as a test lab, and they'd say, test these please. Now obviously we'd get the product out, and if this was an original test for a manufacturer, we'd be saying put it into bottom channel, middle channel, top channel, stop it hopping, set it to maximum power, things like that. But we didn't have that option, and we couldn't contact the manufacturer because we were doing market surveillance testing. So we would just put it on the test site and do our best, really. You'd sellotape over the button to make it transmit, or if it was Wi-Fi, we'd make it stream a very large file. So let's say it was a user device for Wi-Fi, you would upload a big long file or play Spotify or other music playing things are available, and so you would place, use something to exercise. If it was Bluetooth, just set it into a hopping mode, and then you'd be the test engineer's responsibility then. For Bluetooth, for example, you stop it hopping during the test to make it easier to test. So you're testing it in a real mode where it's frequency hopping. The engineer has to know how to capture that, because if you test it wrong, you're going to say, wow, amazing, there was no emissions at all, because your analyzer won't have been catching the hopping signal. So challenges for the test engineer, but yeah, it's going to be a real life mode. And that's one interesting twist that the ETSI standards don't really pick up on, is the ETSI standards for a radio. Let's look at spurious emissions. They give you two choices. You can either attach the antenna and do a radiated emissions test with the antenna on transmitting, or you can disconnect the antenna and you can do a conducted antenna port test and then terminate the antenna port and do radiated without the antenna connected. A lot of manufacturers will take the easy option of conducted spurious emissions from the antenna port and then terminate the antenna port and perform radiated emissions of the radio without the antenna connected. It's most likely to pass that way. That's what most people will do. Market surveillance, of course, will test it transmitting with the antenna on. So something to think about. Yeah, okay, that was it. That was the last question. The rest is just thanking Laura for being good.
Thanks very much, Michael. It's great to go over all those questions and find out all the details. So thanks for doing that. And thank you again, everybody, for attending. As Michael already mentioned, we'll be hosting the fourth part in our radio webinar series the same time next week on the 15th of July. So that's going to be on RED and UK radio modules. Exactly the same time, we're going to have a morning and an afternoon session. I'll send a link to the recording of this presentation and also details on how to register for the next presentation if you haven't done so already. So please do keep an eye out for that. And finally, a short survey will appear on your screen. So if you can take the time to answer that, we do really appreciate any feedback you can give us. Thanks again, everybody, for listening. And thank you, Michael. Thanks again for presenting. I look forward to speaking to you soon. Thank you.
Yeah.